Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of RTAC. I'm here today to share with you the results of Compass's 50-state funding study. This item begins on page, or is on page 16 in your packet, and the full study report is also available on the Compass website, on the RTAC webpage under supplemental, as well as on the resource development webpage. I'll share with you first why we undertook the study in the first place. What types of things we were looking at, what kinds of questions we were hoping to get answered, the results of the study, and then next steps moving on from here. I also want to give a shout out to WSP, who is our consultant on the study. Dave Sherman, I believe, is online on the Zoom call with WSP. This was a huge lift, and they put a ton of time and effort into this, and we're really appreciative of that. So I'll start off with why we did this in the first place. And as all of you know, it's no secret, we have a huge transportation funding shortfall. Our estimate from when we were completing Communities in Motion 2050 was $193 million per year across the two counties as our funding shortfall to the year 2050. That's due to a lot of different reasons. One of them is a lack of dedicated funding for public transportation. Excuse me. So that contributes significantly to that shortfall, as well as disproportionately low surface transportation and block grant funding, specifically for the Nampa urban area, but also for our rural areas. Also, the federal fuel tax is not keeping up. As you all know, our transportation system is significantly funded by our fuel tax, but as our cars are getting more and more efficient and we have more and more electric vehicles, we're generating less revenue per mile driven. And finally, we have very few local tools that we can actually use to deal with all of these issues. So those are the types of things that generated us wanting to do this study in the first place. We had a lot of questions going into it. What our states are doing, what maybe innovative ideas are out there that we haven't thought about. We get a lot of questions about local option sales tax. We have been pushing for that for 20 years. We often hear from people is, are we still doing the right thing? Are we barking up the wrong tree on that? Or should we still be pushing for local option sales tax? What types of funding could generate the most revenue? And what types of funding can we actually avail ourselves of? And then a look at road usage charges or vehicle mile travel fees. And would those potentially be a viable option moving forward in Idaho? So in the study, we looked at 4 primary areas. The first was local transportation funding options. The second was public transportation funding options. The third was the suballocation of surface transportation block grant funds. And the fourth was road usage charges. And again, the study looked at how these funds are generated or what different states are doing across all 50 states. So I'll very briefly share a high level of what we learned. The study was immense. We have 7 reports. I did a quick calculation. We have over 89,000 data points. So what I give today will be a very high level summary. As I said, the full report is online, and if you have more detailed questions, I'm happy to sit down and visit with you and look at other pieces of that with you. Today will just be a very high summary. So to start off with local funding tools, WSP in our study looked at 11 different types of local funding tools, from local option sales tax to income taxes to hotel taxes. Of those, just a few are available to us currently in Idaho. Local option sales tax is, but as we all know, it's very limited only to resort cities with a population of less than 10,000. Property tax is available to us for transportation, local registration fees, as well as impact fees, which again, they'll have a lot of limitations, and hotel taxes, which also have a lot of limitations and have very specific uses. Looking nationally, property taxes are by far the most commonly used local transportation funding tool, with 42 of the 50 states using property tax in some way, shape, or form. Although, as we all know, it is not a very popular tax in Idaho, or really anywhere. But Idaho is one of the states that does use that property tax. When looking at the fees, vehicle registration fees and impact fees were the most commonly used fees across the nation to fund local or to generate local funding for transportation. Our consultants also looked at what could generate the most funding for us. And there were 3 different types of taxes or fees that could reach that $193 million per year. And that was sales tax, property tax, and income tax. And I do want to point out, as you're looking at the figures here on the screen, in order to generate these types of figures, a lot of assumptions went into these, and they're very well documented, and they're very logical assumptions. But I will point out that they are assumptions. You could use a different set of assumptions and get different figures, but it still gives you a very good sense of what theoretically could generate the most revenue. However, not all of these are available to us at this point. So then moving on to public transportation funding. For this, we really learned that Idaho is definitely bucking the trend. Most states are actually moving towards more flexible funding and planning for transportation, and really moving more towards just transportation funding that can be used for roadways, public transportation, bike or ped, really just however it's needed, instead of having different buckets for different types of funding. They're looking for regions and states to really plan more holistically for the transportation system. Also, most states are actually increasing their levels of public transportation funding. Local transportation funding, at the same time, where there is combined with state public transportation funding, really is used as a combination. For the most part, they were not an either or, state funding or local funding for public transportation, but really the two working in concert together. The other thing that we really saw is there are many, many nuances to how this plays out. Report, I think there are 3 pages of footnotes of nuances of the public transportation funding and who is doing what and what that means. So very generally though, looking, most states provide state public transportation funding as well as provide locals with the ability to raise their own funding. That's 37 of the 50 states. 2 states provide state funding, but don't provide locals the option to generate their own funding. But there are a couple of caveats with that. I said all of these have nuances. Georgia does allow locals to generate their own funding in just 4 counties surrounding Atlanta for MARTA. And Tennessee does allow a local fuel tax to be used for any type of transportation, which could include public transportation. Several states also allow locals to generate funding without providing state funding. Again, there are a lot of nuances with that, a lot of exceptions and caveats. Really, the big thing to look at is that last column with the 2 states that do not provide significant state funding nor allow locals to generate their own funding. For years, we have said we are one of only 2 states in this category. That is still true. However, we have been citing the wrong state. We have been saying it's Idaho and Mississippi. Turns out we are with West Virginia and not with Mississippi in that category. So looking at that, the most promising types of funding, again, are very similar to the local funding, which are property tax, which can generate significant funding and is allowed in Idaho. But as we know, there are a lot of restrictions on property tax, and it is also not a very popular way of funding. And then local option sales tax, which is what we have been looking at for a long time. So it does tell us that we probably have been going the right direction with that. The next that I'll delve into is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Suballocation. This one gets a little bit more in the weeds than the other topics that we're talking about in this. And this is something that Tony has talked to you about several times over the last couple of years. I'll give kind of a quick high-level background to get us hopefully up to speed. And if there are really detailed questions, I may punt those to Tony. But Surface Transportation Block Grant, STBG, which you talk about a lot in this meeting, is one of the 9 core federal funding programs. It's a significant funding program with 23% of the federal funding, and it is the most flexible of those programs. And it is also designed to be suballocated to the regions. So the federal government gives it to the state governments, to the DOTs, and then the DOTs suballocate that funding to the different parts of the state. With that, 55% of that surface transportation block grant funding by law is required to be sub-allocated to the regions, while the states can use 45% wherever they like. The federal government also provides what are called computational tables, which are essentially a table for every region in the nation, and based on their calculations, how much funding that individual region should get. Those tables are recommended, but they are not required. That said, they are very transparent, very easy to use. You can just go and find your area on there and see your dollar figure. And so they are very easy, very transparent, both for the public and for public agencies. That said, there is a wide variety of interpretation and practice and how all of these things work. First of all, looking at the STBG suballocation, as I said, states are required to suballocate at least 55%, and most suballocate either 55% or more than 55%. However, you will see a section on there of states that suballocate less than 55%. Idaho is in there, but just barely at 51%, which does kind of beg the question, if it's a requirement, how does that work? And it really comes down to interpretation and how states are working with some of the local regions to spend state funding, but for those projects that the regions want. And they're including that as being suballocated to the regions, often in very small regions where those communities don't have the ability to actually take the funding and do their own projects. In addition, most states use the computational tables. Just 17% of these states that responded did not. I will back up for every topic except for this. We have data from all 50 states. For the STBG suballocation, we only have data from 48 states. So the information here is based on 48 states and not from 50 like it is on the other three parts of the study. But Idaho is one of the few states that does not directly use those computational tables. So what does that look like in Idaho, especially for us here in the Treasure Valley? Regions over 200,000 transportation management areas are required to get a certain amount of funding. And so the Boise urban area does get that funding. Approximately 24%, if you do the math, it's slightly off due to rounding, but essentially 24%. However, the computational tables show that regions 50 to 200,000, such as the Nampa urban area, should be receiving 31%. And here they're just receiving 20. And that our smaller regions should be receiving approximately 15%, and they are just receiving 10. And then if you look at our very small areas, our rural areas, per the computational tables, they should be receiving 31% of the funding, and in Idaho, they're receiving 45%. So there are some mismatches there between what the computational tables are showing and what Idaho is doing. That said, the tables are technically a recommendation. They are not a requirement. Come on. So again, a lot of this is subject to interpretation. As with the public transportation, there's a lot of nuance. And really a lot of this comes down to project selection. I know for me going into this study, the idea of suballocating to regions versus spending anywhere in the state always seemed odd, because anywhere in the state is in somebody's region. But really it comes down to who is choosing those projects and who is involved in that project selection in terms of how that funding is being spent, whether it's strictly a DOT project or whether it is a regional project that the region has selected, regardless of whether the regional agency or local agency or DOT is the one actually constructing that project. So that's really where a lot of that nuance comes in. For the states that did participate in this survey for this, the state DOTs overall all indicated that they had a very collaborative process with their regions and were working very closely in that project selection. I will say though that that was based strictly on the DOT's interpretation. We don't know from the regions if the MPOs or the locals also felt that it was a collaborative process, but from a DOT standpoint, that they felt like that they were working well with their regions to choose those projects. And finally, looking at road usage charges. I'm going to give a little bit of background of what these are because some of us are not as familiar with them. We don't use these in Idaho. But a road usage charge, also called a vehicle mile travel fee, is based on the number of miles that you drive, as opposed to either the amount of gas that you purchase or in some instances, as opposed to a flat fee. It is used really to offset the decrease in transportation funding coming from the fuel tax, again, because of EVs, because of low fuel or high fuel efficient vehicles. There are 3 active programs right now in the US, and Hawaii is about to start a program here in 2025. So there will very shortly be 4 active programs. But there have been multiple pilot programs going on over the years. There are several ongoing now, really all over the US. I will point out in our 2019 A Lot Can Change in 30 Years survey, we asked residents about different types of implementation strategies for a wide variety of different policies. And by far and away, a vehicle mile travel tax was the lowest rated by orders of magnitude. So at least at this point, it is something that is not seen very favorably locally. However, my personal opinion is I do think education about what it is and is not, I think would make somewhat of a difference because we got a lot of open-ended comments thinking people were going to be charged twice for their gas and for their mileage. But let's look a little bit at how this would work. So we're going to have a tale of 2 laughs. My son drives a 1998 Ford F-150 and I drive a 2013 Prius. Paying gas tax at the pump, if he were to drive 100 miles, he pays about $2.83 or excuse me, $2.38, $2.40, where I would be paying about 73 cents. If we were both charged based on the miles driven, we would each pay about $2. So it would provide some equity for both of us, but also me, who is not contributing as much to the gas tax, would be paying more of my fair share. Another way of using a local, or excuse me, a road usage charge is replacing a flat fee for electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids like Idaho has. If you have an EV, you don't pay a gas tax, but you do pay a flat registration fee of $140 on top of your normal registration fee. So if you were to look at it that way, if you had person number 1 with their EV and they drove 1,000 miles a year, they may choose to use a road usage charge tax because that would be lower than an additional registration fee. However, if person 2 drove 10,000 miles a year, the lower, the flat fee would be less than a road usage charge tax. So just to give you a sense of how that could work and how that plays out. And again, obviously, these are just illustrative, but it gives a sense of where things come in. So as I said, there are 3 active programs right now in the US. All 3 programs are very different. I think interestingly enough, 2 are our neighbors, Oregon and Utah. Oregon's is voluntary and it is used to replace the gas tax for certain high fuel efficient vehicles. For Utah and Virginia, it's also voluntary, but in their case, it is used to replace a flat fee like that $140 that Idaho has on electric vehicles. And in their case, it's also on high fuel efficient vehicles. So they are using it in different ways and have implemented it in different ways. So there are a lot of considerations looking at this. One of them is the type of vehicle. Do you apply this to all vehicles? So my son's instance, he actually would be paying less. Right now, it is only being applied in the states that are using it to the high fuel efficient vehicles. So it's using it to offset that loss of fuel tax, but it is not being used to bring down the cost for those that are paying high fuel tax. As I'm sure you're all aware, privacy is a huge issue with this. People are very concerned about Big Brother knowing where they're going. And that can really be addressed through different reporting mechanisms. All of the states that run this have a lot of different options, everything from very low tech. You have an odometer check and you pay based on, A minus B, and that's how much you drove and that's what you pay. No one knows where you went. No one knows what you did. To very sophisticated that can track where you drove. Also can give you feedback on various other things through onboard diagnostics in your car. That can be advantageous too. For instance, if you lived in Ontario and worked in Boise, then you could not be paying a fuel or a road usage charge tax for those miles you drove in Idaho. You would only be paying it in Oregon. So there are a lot of considerations there, but having those options and also the fact that all of these currently are voluntary definitely helps some with some of those privacy concerns. Compliance, though, also is a real concern. Right now with fuel tax, we pay at the pump. You really can't get out of it. It's the distributors that are paying the tax. With something like this, where it would be charged for every individual, you have lots of points of contact and lots more opportunities for people, for instance, to try to find a way to get out of paying their tax. So dealing with compliance issues is a concern and something that those states that are working with us are working on. And finally, cost, because again, you're collecting fees from many individuals as opposed from a few distributors. It also is pretty costly to implement. Most of the states or all of the states that are using this do this through a contractor. That also helps deal with some of the privacy concerns as well. But it is something to overcome to make sure it's generating enough revenue to offset the cost to make sure it actually still is a net positive. So to summarize just some of our few takeaways, looking at local transportation funding options. Property tax is definitely the most common throughout the entire US. A property tax, income tax, and sales tax are those that could generate the most. That said, it's really valuable to be looking at those options that we actually do have available to us. Local option registration fees is one. Impact fees, although they're limited in certain uses, is definitely another that can help with those local funding projects. Public transportation, we are definitely bucking the trend in terms of flexibility and amount of funding going towards public transportation. One of two states without either state dedicated funding or the ability for locals to raise their own funding. And again, sales and property tax would be the most promising in Idaho. Surface Transportation Block Grant suballocation. Most states are using the computational tables. Idaho is one of the few states that is not. And our regions with populations between 5 and 200,000, especially those between 50 and 200,000, are really getting shortchanged. And the DOTs nationwide really did, though, report collaborative processes in working with their local jurisdictions in selecting projects and making sure that local projects, whether they're local agency projects or state projects that the locals want to see done, are moving forward. And finally, road usage charges can be used to help offset declines in the gas tax, but they are expensive to implement. There are issues, there are concerns, and really kind of the takeaway is providing different options can really help with a lot of that, with public acceptance from, do I have to do this, from privacy concerns and others. And looking at next steps, we're going to continue to share the results. We'll be bringing this to the Compass Board in February. Also presenting in February at the National Association of Regional Councils and looking at some other conferences as well from around the country to be able to share this with our peers. Our peer agencies around the country have expressed a great deal of interest in this study, so anxious to share it with them. We'll continue to work and advocate, especially for that surface transportation block grant suballocation. As Tony has talked to you about before, we've been working hard to try to get that changed so that it is a little more equitably distributed around the state. Also want to dive deeper into innovative ideas. I shared today kind of some broad takeaways. There were a couple of just one-off things that maybe one state or one region is doing that I think is worth exploring a little bit more. And then finally, keep learning. Our first education series for the year will be February 3rd and 4th, and it will be Utah Department of Transportation, and they're going to share information on their road usage charge program, pros and cons, what has worked, what hasn't worked, public acceptance. So we'll begin promoting that in early January, but if that's something of interest to you, I encourage you to attend that. As always, it'll be a more public evening presentation and a more technical daytime presentation. And with that, I am happy to stand for any questions.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
I have two questions. My first question is the kind of next steps on this to come up with some kind of proactive legislation to pursue funding outside of what our legislative positions are, which can address things that come up. But will this result in like a proactive piece of legislation from this group?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that was Bree. You're very small on my screen. Yes, that's something that we will be looking at, especially as we discuss this with the board in February of how they want to move forward from a legislative position standpoint. It is also something that we definitely will be using the data on this as we have those discussions with our legislature, that we now have really good, hard and fast factual information that we can share as opposed to, you know, hearsay or I've just lost the word I'm looking for, but, you know, examples. We have good information we can share. So regardless, we'll be able to use this to help back up our story and tell a better story about what's happening around the country.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. My second question is more of a comment. I do feel like a little asterisk belongs next to property tax for us, since 2 years ago, legislation that passed restricted the ability somewhat to use ad valorem levies and highway user revenues on things that do not primarily benefit motor vehicles. So if you can make kind of a notation in the study that we do have some limitations on property tax for transportation funding, that would be great.
Yes, and property tax, as in with most of these, has various limitations, concerns, also just the property tax caps as well. Like with impact fees and others have often very specific limitations. So that's a great comment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, this is Nicole. Amy, with the upcoming legislative session and the timing of your next educational series, has there been any contemplation with it being Utah, a very somewhat desirable emulation of who we want to be? Maybe doing an expanded educational series, inviting some of the legislators into, that maybe is not for the focus of the Compass Board or for the focus of staff, but for those legislators who opportunely are here, and it kind of all aligns to have this kind of like, let's talk. Just maybe thinking through like maybe something more broad and expanded, specifically targeted to the legislature.
Yes, Mr. Chair and Nicole, that is something I've thought about. We have done that with a couple of other topics as well. When we brought in Oklahoma City to talk about their local option sales tax, as well as Chandler Duncan. Okay, as well as one other. Anyway, that is something that I have thought about. We're right now in the process of getting ready to hire a government affairs consultants. And so that's something I'll be talking to them about and see if that might be a possibility. At a very minimum, we definitely will be reaching out and letting them know that this is happening. We did have an education series several years ago about Oregon's road usage charge program and push that hard with the legislators as well. It was also during the legislative session. Did not have a special presentation for them, but reached out and invited them, but unfortunately did not get much traction there.
Well, that may have been Oregon versus Utah.
It may have been.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I just would echo Nicole's comment. I know the VRT will also be looking for some opportunities to reach out to the legislature this season, and in particular is looking at Utah to talk about a couple of things related to public transit. So maybe we can talk about that engagement, and if there's an opportunity to coordinate, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you, Stephen.
Mr. Chair, this is Tony. There was a post on the chat, I think it was from Nicole Stern, that she would recommend giving this type of presentation to the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Nicole. And yes, WSP did present on this early in the study, and is definitely something that we can talk about wrapping up at the end, now that we are done as well. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Tom.
Go ahead.
Amy, really, really appreciative of this presentation. I have to admit, I wasn't tracking this study and a lot of good information here. First, I feel like we owe an apology to the state of Mississippi because it seems like for years and years we've been dragging them through the mud, and apparently it's been West Virginia. Yeah.
We'll work on that.
Yeah. Could you go back to the slide that is the pie chart of the computational tables? I think it was
Sorry, there's a delay between when it changes on the computer and when it changes on the screen.
yeah, this one. So I'm just curious. So in the next slide, you highlighted that really the disparity is from the increased allocation to the rural areas. And with the other 17% of the states we looked at, did you see a theme there? Are the states that aren't following the computational tables tend to be ones that are more rural, that have, I guess, more just land area, more roadways outside of those metro areas, or is it kind of dispersed across urban and rural states?
That's a great question. And broadly, I would say it's dispersed. That said, there are, especially as we're looking at where the state is doing projects more in conjunction with the regions as opposed to suballocating to the regions, that tends to be more in rural areas, regardless of the size of the state. So you will see a lot more variation there, just kind of counteracting or accounting for smaller jurisdictions not having the resources to be able to do something. But in general, the types of states, it really was kind of across the board, and every single one of them had a different way of then suballocating and how they worked with their different regions. And so more or less aligned. Some said they did not use the computational tables, but their percentages were identical. And so, the result was the same, even if they got there a different way.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I was curious if Compass and perhaps VRT as well are communicating with Association of Idaho Cities and the Idaho Association of Counties on some of these efforts.
Mr. Chair, Lee, to this point, we have not. The study was just completed. You actually are the first group to receive the results of the study. But that is something definitely that's we can put on the radar, and a good thought.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
in response, as far as Valley Regional Transit's concerned, most of our outreach statewide is coordinated through the CTAI, which stands for Community Transportation Association of Idaho, as opposed to the cities directly. And or directly with the transit agencies.
Well, if no other questions, thank you very much.